Hey everyone! Today we'll be beating Echoes of Wisdom in the most extreme minimalist fashion possible. Not only will we be learning the minimum number of echoes, but we're going to obtain the bare minimum possible of heart pieces, heart containers, might crystals, food items, accessories, clothing, bottles, stamp cards, dungeon maps, small keys, and rupees. We're even going to see which of Link's weapons we can skip. No weapon level ups will be allowed either. Just to spice things up a little more, I'm going to do the whole thing as a no damage run. If I take damage, I load back to the last save. I only have 3 hearts anyway, so surely this will be an inconsequential decision that I won't later regret. This is a summit challenge for those of us who know that nothing ruins a game like having to collect things. Since this is going to be a no damage playthrough, I might as well set the difficulty to hero mode. I'm not going to go in depth explaining how I arrived at the minimal set of echoes. I've already done a video on that, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. That video received a comment from Link the Pringles Man, highlighting superior echo choices. I agreed with these suggestions, so that's the echo set I settled on for this playthrough. As a quick summary, you need 10 echoes in a glitchless playthrough. The table, 2 statues, the ancient orb, as well as something for each of fire, ice, electricity, wind, bombs, and digging. The real added challenge is going to come from combat. Any of Link's weapons I am required to pick up, as well as sword fighter energy, will remain at level 1. No level ups at Lueburry's house allowed. This, combined with very limited combat echoes, is going to make no damage a real pain. I tried a few things to get through the purple barrier without picking up the sword, but as expected, nothing seemed to work. I had a wacky idea to even try to avoid getting any little blue energy shard pickups. However, I quickly abandoned this idea, as it seems at some points, especially during boss fights, you are forced to absorb several of these pickups with no way to avoid them. I'd be receiving might crystals for completing dungeons and mending rifts. The key to minimizing these was to only complete the strictly mandatory rifts. Of course, I'd be skipping the heart container as I left the still world. After what felt like forever inside Lueburry's house, I was finally off to my next stop. I tried to avoid cutting the grass so I wouldn't accidentally pick up a rupee. I chose to do the Zora quest before the Gerudos, but it really doesn't matter. While clearing the stilled upper Zora River, I learned the bombfish echo. The bombfish would be one of my go-to combat echoes, and I immediately put it to use here. After completing the rest of the busy work in the Zora quest, it was time to defeat Jabu's echo and climb up to the Jabul ruins dungeon. This room in the dungeon was the first spot in the game where I had a few deaths and had to revise my approach. Instead of trying to move the crate and swim through the underwater passage, I immediately got out of the water and traversed around the outside of the room. Here, I hit another room where I failed a few times to get through without damage. 2 rooms later, in the same branch of the dungeon, I had to defeat 4 Tektites. What I realized here though is that loading a save file brings you back to the start of the dungeon, or the last warp point, so taking damage partway down a branch would mean having to re-clear any difficult rooms. Thankfully, it wasn't an issue this time. I took a shortcut up to the boss without activating the final switch. Normally, I'd have a level 2 sword for this boss. I noticed the difference already, needing to strike the boss considerably more times with my level 1 sword. I had a few hiccups, but cleared the boss damage-free without too much trouble. It was now time to head to the Gerudo Desert, but first, I stopped in at the Eastern Temple to acquire the Spark Echo. This electricity echo would be multi-purpose, also being able to carry me through tricky side-scrolling sections using reverse bond. I then detoured over to Eldin Volcano to acquire the Gerudo Echo. Gerudo is also multi-purpose. It can both blow away sand piles and allow you to glide. I proceeded through the Gerudo quest, also acquiring Whole Mill, needed for a single dig in Ancestor's Cave of Rest. Next came an unfortunate blow in my efforts to not collect things. Part of the Gerudo quest involves making a smoothie for an exhausted Gerudo soldier, which requires you to receive 2 pieces of chili cactus. But that's not all. You also need 10 rupees, which would force me to acquire my first rupee of the game, then go grass cutting for 9 more. This would be the only instance in the game where I was forced to acquire food or rupees, just a small but necessary blemish on my playthrough. In the still desert temple ruins, I flew with Gerudo to this friend of Try's instead of building a long staircase. Before I knew it, I had gained access to Gerudo sanctum. I'd have to remain careful not to pick up rupees or food by accident, but regardless, this dungeon was pretty smooth sailing. Again, I'd leave chests behind such as this one that contained the map, or anything else unnecessary. I'd learn the Hawk Statue Echo, then move on to the battle with Link. I cleared this one on my second try, after switching from Bombfish to Ignizel as my method of inflicting damage. Here, I made the decision to leave the bow behind. I wasn't certain that the bow was skippable, but I figured I could always return later to claim it if in fact I needed it. Immediately, you come to a purple barrier that you're presumably supposed to use the bow to destroy. But by carefully assembling a staircase, you can get close enough to destroy it with your sword. From there, I grabbed the Elephant Statue Echo, meaning I had already claimed 8 of the 10 required echoes. I used the twin statues to progress to the boss room, where I easily moved on without a death. Next up was dungeon number 4 inside the expanding Hyrule Castle Rift. I decided to comply with a comment on my previous video from Asher Basher, demanding more equitable treatment for the elephant. I'd always choose elephant over hawk on this playthrough. I took a shortcut here that brought me straight to the small key that I needed. A short while later, through the locked door, I would reach this battle that looked intimidating, but was easy to clear just by throwing Bombfish. And here, I had to grab the boss key while leaving behind the best item in the game, the Frog Ring, which doubles your jump height. Thankfully, viewers let me know that Sword Fighter form can also be used to double jump height, so at least I'd have an alternative. I moved on to fight Ganon, and this was the most challenging boss of the playthrough so far. It wasn't anything absurd, but it did drag on for a while, using just my level 1 sword to damage him. I decided to tackle the Faron Temple next. Tri was still at level 5, and I wasn't allowed to complete optional rifts to increase his level. So I still had only 4 triangles to use, not 5. I could have gotten 5 triangles by completing the mandatory pre-temple rift in each of the 3 regions, but I didn't want to bounce around like that if I could avoid it. I recalled the platforming being the least demanding in the Faron Temple, so I set off to tackle that one. It was a quick escape from Deku Scrub Jail, then an uneventful climb through the stilled Faron wetlands, and I found myself entering the Faron Temple. I don't have this temple well laid out in my head. I'm still not sure where the optimal entrance is or what route I should take. On this playthrough, I entered this way and quickly made my way to the small key. Note that this temple does have an unnecessary small key, and I avoided it in true minimalist fashion. I used the key to fight round 1 against the mini-boss. No real challenge here. After activating these dual switches at the same time, I entered another battle. The electric Wizrobe took a long time, but patiently throwing Bombfish at him eventually proved to be a winning strategy. I'd grab my second small key of the dungeon, and with an assist from Spark, I was off for round number 2 with the temple's mini-boss. I'd have a few deaths here in what turned out to be quite a lengthy battle. Annoyingly, there are no Sword Fighter energy refills in this battle, so after dispatching the first 2 heads, I had to slowly take out the other 2 heads using only Bombfish. Before taking on the big boss, I stepped outside to refill my Sword Fighter energy, taking advantage of the fact that falling into the abyss doesn't inflict any damage. It didn't take long fighting the boss until I started wishing I had the bow. You need to hit the boss's eye while it's up on the wall, and throwing Bombfish at it wasn't getting me anywhere. I tried climbing up to the eye and hitting it with my sword, and aha, this actually worked. I would fail 6 times at this boss, half of which came from me setting myself on fire. My level 1 Sword Fighter energy became a bit of a pain. Although there were some refills floating around the room, I would still deplete it, forcing me to attack with only Bombfish for long stretches. It took some time, but I eventually finished this boss off, meaning there were just 2 temples to go, and Tri was now leveled up to have a 5th triangle. Next up, I chose Lanayru Temple, with my reasoning being that here I would learn a powerful combat echo, the Ice Wizrobe. When walking around Hebra Mountain, I had to carry Ignizel with me to avoid taking damage from the cold. I made it to Conde's home, and then to stilled Hebra Mountain Cave. After mending the rift, I continued my climb, and had my first encounter with the Ice Wizrobe. I did have a couple deaths here, but with some patience and a whole lot of Bombfish, I eventually took it out, and claimed my 9th and most powerful echo. The Ice Wizrobe doesn't damage ice monsters, so I still had to use my Bombfish and Ignizel for some battles. After a bit more climbing, I reached Stilled Hebra Mountain. I could now use the Ice Wizrobe to easily take out any enemy that was annoying me. It felt almost like a cheat code. There was plenty of platforming here, and I made good use of Gerudo for gliding, as well as Sword Fighter form for extra jump height. A short while later, I would reach Lanayru Temple. Without the frog ring, I built staircases to get the hot orbs over the ice jets safely. Similar to last time, I used a carefully assembled double elephant, triple table staircase to bridge this difficult gap. After a bit more progress, I would arrive at the temple's mini-boss. I wasn't expecting much here, but this turned out to be the biggest hurdle of the challenge so far. This guy self-divides as you attack him, meaning you have to destroy a total of 15 green goo monsters. As the battle progresses, you inevitably get several of these monsters hopping around simultaneously. It was difficult to dodge all of them, while avoiding objects falling from the ceiling. I find the shadows of these falling objects to be very faint in this room, and I would regularly misjudge where I needed to be standing. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to get through the entire battle without taking a hit. Since many of the hits did not kill me, this was the first instance in the run where the decision to go no damage instead of just 3 hearts normal mode made things significantly harder. However, the worst was definitely yet to come. I reached the Wolfos battle. I used an approach with 2 guardian elephants, repeatedly placing Bombfish in the opening to both block myself off and damage the Wolfos. Finally, I took down the white Wolfos. But sure enough, this is where one of the final remaining children snuck in between Bombfish and killed me. I'd switch over from Bombfish to using a set of 3 Ignizels, and this both provided better protection for me, while also inflicting damage more consistently. From here, I'd soon be grabbing the boss key and moving on to the temple's boss. I would have to restart this battle a handful of times while getting my feet under me, but overall, this battle was trivial compared to the temple's mini-boss. Now I headed to Goron City with my sights set on the game's final dungeon, Eldin Temple. This Lizalfos battle was tricky. So tricky, in fact, that I didn't notice myself grab this rupee in the middle of the battle. My worst nightmare had come true. I proceeded on with the playthrough, not noticing the lone rupee in my inventory. I reached Rock Roast Quarry, and through pure luck, happened to pause the game and notice the rupee. But some panic set in as I tested save point after save point, and noticed I had the rupee at each of them. I booted up the oldest save data remaining, and much to my relief, I saw the rupee was gone. Phew, the run would have been botched if I had taken just slightly longer to notice the rupee, but I was fortunate. I redid the first half of the Goron quest, and shortly after, was headed to Eldin Temple without any rupees. I made this as easy as I could on myself, relying on Gerudo for gliding and elephants for walking across lava. This temple didn't throw a whole lot at me that was difficult to handle. After my Ice Wizrobe activated this switch, I wasn't sure how to quickly escape the lava without damage, so I simply warped back to the start of the temple. My Ice Wizrobe made quick work of Link, and of course, I left the bombs behind. After grabbing the boss key, I simply glided out of the rising lava room. For once, instead of throwing Bombfish at a Wizrobe, I was able to let my own Wizrobe take it out while I did almost nothing. Having the Ice Wizrobe echo really did feel almost unfair to me. I was struggling to take out this final bomb block. I couldn't spawn tables underneath myself to ascend the vertical space to my right without the frog ring. I eventually blew away the bomb block by placing a Bombfish on top of a double table. From here, I glided to the boss room and got the battle with Volvagia underway. I had a couple deaths, but settled on having my Ice Wizrobe inflict all the damage while I did almost nothing, and the strategy paid off. In Eternal Forest, I learned the 10th and final echo, the Ancient Orb, and proceeded into the Stilled Ancient Ruins. Here, I abused the game's decision to not damage you for falling into a pit by repeatedly plunging into the abyss while my Ice Wizrobe took out a swarm of monsters. Ridiculous as it sounds, it was the safest way not to take damage. After a bit more progress, I would come to the battle with Zelda's Echo. As has become the norm, I let my Ice Wizrobe do most of the work while I ran away from the monsters. on my second attempt, I succeeded. Now, to free Link from the floating crystal. Oh no. Don't you need the bow to break the crystal? I was prepping myself for a trip back to Gerudo Sanctum to claim the bow. But first, I built a tower up to the crystal and tried my sword. To my surprise, the sword actually worked. Also to my surprise, in the final sequence, Link does not have his bow or bombs. I mean, this does make sense, since you give Link back his weapons, and you never acquired those. But I was surprised the game was actually programmed this way. Inside of Null's body, Link and the Ice Wizrobe took out the first room of monsters, while I stayed out of harm's way. The next room of monsters wouldn't be so easy, since Link and I would be separated. I tried a Guardian Elephant approach, but could not get the elephants down in time. I would have a few deaths, and then the Ice Wizrobe would carry me to victory. I'd use Spark to ascend this room, and then that was it. I had finally arrived at the final boss on a full minimalist, no damage playthrough of the game. Almost done, right? Wrong. What was in store for me was way worse than I had anticipated. Hey, if you're enjoying the video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. It'll really help me out. The battle with Null starts off innocently. Just stretch out one of his arms, have Link chop it off, rinse and repeat many times. Then you move on to Phase 2, this underwater side-scrolling bit where you chase Null while spawning bombfish at him. I would occasionally die during this phase, but for the most part, it was pretty toothless as well. The third phase also starts off easy, having to chop off 5 of Null's arms, while occasionally having to dodge an attack from a dungeon boss. You need to master 2 different fine skills. First, standing still at the edge of the room, and second, lazily drifting to the left. So we're already partway through the third and final phase. Sounds like this boss is a cakewalk, huh? Not so much. Coming up is where total chaos breaks loose, and a mistake at this point means I need to repeat more than 5 minutes of boring, mind-numbing battle. In this chaos, you're required to stretch out 3 wall arms, one at a time, while Link chops them off. But this time around, there is an army of monsters attacking you and Link, as well as a floor hand trying to capture you. I did learn that the initial arm always would spawn in the upper left corner of the room, and if I stretched it out immediately, Link would almost always get it in time. So there's a freebie, 1 down. This run was unusually lucky in that we dispatched a second arm immediately afterwards. 1 to go. But in general, you need the stars to perfectly align to be able to lock onto an arm, stretch it out, and then hold this for long enough without a monster forcing you to run away, for Link to slowly make his way over to the arm and chop it off. I had too many deaths here to count. I'll show you just a small sample of them. And this is where my decision to go no damage and flip the game to hero mode really came back to bite me. On normal mode, most of these attacks will not kill you, and heart refills drop constantly. So as long as you don't take 2 consecutive hits, you're golden. But on hero mode, I was having some real doubts as to whether I could complete this challenge. I had a lapse of focus while waiting for Link to chop this arm, and I got captured by a floor hand. I estimate the spell's death like 99% of the time. When this happens, I spawn bombfish around me and hope that they, and Link, can shield me from the monsters while damaging the hand enough to free me. This almost never works. But this time, for some reason, there were less monsters than usual. And miraculously, this run happened to be in the 1%. I took my lucky break, and shortly after, dispatched the final arm and got to move on to the next part of the battle, which didn't happen to me very often. This time, the boss attacks that appear are tougher to dodge. The one I struggled with is the triple Ganon attack. I eventually achieved some consistency here by moving left to right, then to bottom right through the middle of the Ganons. Next up, we've got dual Scorchills spinning all around the room. My guardian elephants do an amazing job at protecting me from this. After dodging the dreaded triple Ganons once more, I was reaching rarefied air, for me at least. I had only been this deep into the battle without damage a handful of times. And yep, it was time for another absolutely chaotic sequence of chopping off 3 wall arms while running from an army of monsters and the floor hand. The monsters are different this time around, mostly Lizalfos. Interestingly, I find they pay less attention to me than the Darknuts from the previous round. But at the same time, they can lunge deceptively far with their spears, so I never feel safe. And unlike the previous rounds, I hadn't figured out a way to get any arms for free at the start. After what felt like an eternity, I now had just 5 more Null arms between me and victory. But the boss attacks become even more difficult to dodge. First up were 2 pairs of Ganons. This one isn't so bad if you twirl in between them like so. Up next were 6 Ganons, and this had me terrified, given how many times 3 Ganons had killed me. I traced the outside of the room, and somehow came out of it unharmed. Next up were triple Scorchills. Again, my guardian elephants protected me from this one. With 1 arm left, I feared the spiderwebs would get in the way, so I got to work burning them. But I was super careful not to set myself on fire here. Null reappeared with a single arm left, but I was slow getting over to it. To my horror, we didn't have time to chop it off, and my most hated boss to dodge, Ganon, reappeared. I made the mistake of hanging out beside one of the Ganons instead of dropping to the bottom right corner, and now had an awkward angle to work with. Visions of dying with a single Null arm left started filling my brain. Things played out in slow motion as I tried to split the 2 Ganons. To my amazement, I survived here, even though the lower Ganon looks ridiculously close to having hit me. I got 1 more chance with Null's final arm, and this time, didn't mess it up. After several hours of grinding against this boss, I had done it. This is a good time to review which items were actually collected. No heart pieces or heart containers, the jail key and membership card from the Deku quest, 45 might crystals, Try should just barely be at level 9, level 1 sword and level 1 sword fighter energy, although this was given back to Link so it isn't pictured here, 2 chili cacti and 10 rupees which were used during the Gerudo quest, no smoothies, 2 items of clothing and no accessories, and 10 learned echoes. And for good measure, let's double check hero mode is still selected. Remember to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.